Good afternoon, folks of YouTube. 'Tis I, the old geek again, with another old school AD&D module review. Now, you might be mistaken into believing this is going to be a review of EX2 by seeing what I've got behind me. But no, in this review, I'm going to cover EX1 Dungeonland. I've put EX2 there because my copy of EX1 did not survive the great cull of the early 2000s, and I now only have it in PDF form. EX1 was written by Gary Gygax and was published in 1983 alongside its sister module, the one there, The Land Beyond the Magic Mirror. These were not a series of modules per se, but rather two adventures that were designed to be run alongside one another, with the maps linking together. They were inspired by the works of Lewis Carroll, with EX1 Dungeonland focusing on Alice's adventures in Wonderland, and EX2 concentrating on Through the Looking Glass. I won't be covering EX2 in this review though, as my group didn't reach the areas covered by that module. So, EX1 Dungeonland. Presentation. It's a little bit patchy. The cover art by Jim Holloway is not one of his best pieces, and yet he's the sort of artist who you thought would have thrived with this sort of subject matter. A note here, in keeping with the overall silliness of the two modules, the cover of EX1 displays an encounter from EX2, and vice versa. Thus, that cover there you see is suitable for an EX1 review because that's an encounter in EX1. Internal artwork isn't by Jim Holloway. It's by Timothy Truman, and his work tends to have quite a dark and imposing feel to it. While it's not outstanding by any means, it's not bad, and the overall tone does actually fit the module's themes rather nicely. There are a number of maps, both on the inside cover and inside the booklet itself, and while they serve their purpose, they are not exactly pleasing on the eye. They look rather cluttered. The layout of the text is fine too, with adequate enemy stats, though lacking in XP values and Thacos and that sort of stuff, which the UK modules were doing at this time. And key parts of the text are presented in bold, so it's not hard to read. But the overall impression is that it's not a module that is pleasing on the eye, as while the artwork and text are both competent by themselves, the overall darkness of the images causes a contrast that feels untidy. It lacks the aesthetic consistency of other modules that were released at this time, such as Ravenloft or the Lost Caverns of Sojcanth. For anyone familiar with Lewis Carroll's stories, and who isn't, the plot of Dungeonland should already be known. The party become trapped in an insane and magical world filled with bizarre individuals, the March Hare, the Mad Hatter, and the Cheshire Cat, famous examples. Once they have found the way out, they can come and go from this bizarre world as they please, and thus the module tries to present itself as having a sense of freedom. Dungeonland is described as being a pocket plane, its own little dimension. It was originally created by Gygax as part of his Castle Greyhawk home campaign, something which sadly never saw publication in its original form. Instead, being given to us as WG7, a rather pathetic and childish parody module that is rightfully sneered at by the majority of gamers from the era, at least those with any degree of good sense. Most of the character conversions to the AD&D forms are very interesting. Gygax has done this well. The Cheshire Cat is a Smilodon. The Mock Turtle is a bizarre Gorgon Dragon Turtle hybrid. The Duchess is a crazy dwarven fighter, and many other oddities from the book are simply made up with applicable stats. This part of the module is rather imaginative, and the net results give entertaining and surprising encounters for the party to deal with. EX1 is naturally packed with little tricks and traps, as it should be, often as part of the encounters with the denizens. Some of these are especially deadly. In fact, the entire experience in Dungeonland is one that will test even the most seasoned of players. The recommended level range is 9 to 12, and that is done for a reason. On the surface, the whole of the land is nonsensical and whimsical, but underneath, it is brutal and sadistic. When my campaign was derailed by the party's G3 disaster, I brought the survivors and the backup characters that my players had into Dungeonland, and they didn't last long. First, the caterpillar annihilated half of them, and the remainder decided to play cards with the Mad Hatter. The only one able to return to their own plane of existence afterwards was the Cavalier's retainer, and she was a little bit tainted. Gary Gygax is quite rightly one of the most highly respected module creators. While his rulebooks were notoriously dense and wordy, his adventures were refreshingly open. His descriptions suitably brief and effective. His locations usually logical, with a blend of freedom and imagination, presenting clever players with options and DMs with juicy nuggets to develop as plot hooks. Dungeonland marked a diversion from that style. Here he was attempting to adapt a work of fiction to incorporate the feel of the book along with its general plot. Thus Dungeonland suffers in the same way other later modules suffered. It's linear. Even the wilderness sections feel too direct. Yes, they are traditional location-based adventuring, but those locations are mostly sequential. The finale of the adventure, at the palace of course, revolves around a trial over the theft of some tarts. Not prostitutes, jam tarts. And it feels somewhat scripted. Sadly, my party died before reaching this section, so I'm not an authority on how well this bit actually plays out at the table. EX1 Dungeonland offers fans of Lewis Carroll's work an opportunity to dive into his weird creation. It has all the insanity of the original stories and presents the group with a chance to recite the famous lines. In particular, off with their heads! And such it can be an amusing diversion for any group wanting several sessions of this type of play. The intense lethality, though, probably makes it unsuitable for campaign play. And this presents an odd conflict. It's a crazy, wild world, which is best approached in a carefree manner, but doing so will get the characters killed. Players of nurtured, high-level PCs are more likely to engage with caution, and thus some of the potentially entertaining nonsense will be neutered. My group had a lot of fun with it, but that fun was short-lived, because their characters died as a result. In this manner, EX1 has similar issues to those of Ravenloft, getting a tone of a certain type of fiction to work within the framework of AD&D. But whereas Ravenloft managed to mostly pull it off due to its design, its presentation and its cohesion, Dungeonland does fall apart a little. Gygax writes great modules when working with his own imagination, but his attempt to translate someone else's imagination into D&D doesn't seem to work quite as well. The issues with the linearity are probably most obviously visible in several pieces of the box text. Rather than simply describe the physical locations, some include specific happenings. Take this one for example. Location M, White Marble Palace. This imposing palace is 3 stories high and has several large towers and turrets that are taller still. Fine so far. The grounds around the palace are beautifully kept, and the walkway to the pillared entrance is made of alternating white and red marble slabs. Absolutely perfect at the moment. There are other persons entering the palace, whom you glimpse just as you come in sight of the edifice. Your escort directs you to the main entrance, telling you that a special audience is being held to determine some great matter of state. It's not overly long, but it's obvious that it should only be read at a certain time during a certain event. Now, you might now be thinking, I'm just a humorless old misery guts. Lighten up, John. Embrace the silliness. Yes, I do tend to prefer a more grounded game. But it's far from humorless. Just as I like the magic and the fantasy to be somewhat sparing, so that it has more impact when it happens, I like humour to be the same way. If the nonsense is unrelenting, then it becomes tedious. And if my party had survived to discover the remainder of EX1 and all of EX2, then I think it might have become a little bit tiresome. For me anyway, I think my group might have enjoyed it. We did thoroughly enjoy what we experienced though. The encounter with the White Rabbit, a fabulous character in the module, or the playful elephant-sized dog, great fun. I play in a wacky DCC game. It's a breath of fresh air. 3-hour, fairly short sessions, fortnightly, full of daft jokes, because it remains something different. Played as a one-shot, with a group in the right mood, EX1 can clearly be a lot of fun. But when judging whether a product is objectively good or not, it must be compared with its peers. It's fairly ugly to look at, relatively fiddly to prepare with all the odd individuals and unique characters. And it is linear in its design. But amongst that awkwardness, there are some highly amusing encounters that have been well converted by Gygax from the original fiction. I have attempted to run it once. I doubt I will do so again, and I'll probably never run EX2. But what I will do is mine them for ideas, and thus they will be of some use to me in the future. It's hard to rate this one objectively, so I'm going to look at the ratings I've given to similarly flawed and uneven modules. I think it is clearly better than the Lost Tomb of Martek. It's more consistent. But it's not as good as The Secret of the Slaver's Stockade, which had great villains and that wonderful set-piece siege type encounter at the beginning. So I'm going to give Dungeonland 5 out of 10. 5 is average, but average feels like the wrong word for EX1, because average makes it sound normal, and it's far from normal. A better descriptor would be odd. Well, thanks again for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed the review. Click like and subscribe and help the channel grow. We're heading towards 500 subscribers at the moment. Whee! Which means another live stream is imminent. So look out for that soon. Thank you. Good night. Good afternoon. Whatever time of day it is, it's actually just about afternoon here.